Okay, welcome everybody to Portland Parks Foundation's Green Dreams series. Tonight is kind of an incredible experiment. This is the first live event that we've done since 2019. And it's also our first hybrid event. So this is actually also being broadcast via Zoom. So we have lots of technology and things going on here, and hopefully it's all going to go well. This is the second in a series of programs that we're presenting that have been inspired by the 200th anniversary of Frederick Law Olmsted's birth. And it's part of a nationwide exploration of his life and work and his considerable impact on American life. There have been a number of local programs, and there are ongoing programs all across the country. You can go to olmsted200.org. Portland Parks Foundation's series of programs are presented with the generous support of US Bank, thanks to our stalwart board member, Karen Kervin from US Bank. And also we had some help from Greenworks. Thanks to both of those sponsors. Thanks to our staff, Amy Carlo and Sabrina Boutier, who had put together the technology and worked with Billy from Steeplejack here. It's been a great team effort so far. We're really thankful to be in this wonderful space, thanks to the generosity of Steeplejack. So please order a lot of food, get some drinks, give them a round of applause for hosting this event. Eat and drink well and tip well. So last week we had a totally Zoom event with a really wonderful speaker, Sarah Zodi, from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and an accomplished landscape architect. And she took us on a tour of Frederick Law Olmsted's travels through the South, and talked a lot about his relationship to slavery in terms of thinking about how that was going to inform his thinking about parks, and his incredibly influential writing in the New York Times and in a trio of books that really influenced the dialogue in the northern states about abolition and the Civil War. But she also made this really great argument for how these explorations really shaped his thinking, and also how the roots of landscape architecture really land in there. They really are sort of born of this dialogue, and how they need to get back to it, and shared some wonderful work about how she's trying to fulfill those goals. Tonight we're going to turn over some different stones and look at some of the consequences of Olmsted's very good intentions, and with two of our city's great historians. So first up will be Catherine McNeur, who is Associate Professor of History at PSU. She's the award-winning author of Taming Manhattan, Environmental Battles in the Antebellum City, which is a wonderful book that I've just started, really, but it's an incredibly wonderful look at New York and its sort of beginnings. She's currently writing Sister Scientists, the Forgotten Women Who Transformed American Science, about the work of Margaretta Morris and Elizabeth Morris, both botanists, very influential. And her work really explores a wide spectrum of topics and ideas. A recent essay on COVID-19 and 19th century rabies outbreaks, and to more local subjects like Rooted in History, Portland's heritage trees. And she also works with students who've done a really wonderful set of podcasts on heritage trees in Portland, which you can hear on SoundCloud. And then after Catherine, Catherine will be talking about the lesser known histories of the development of Frederick Law Olmsted's first, and of course, still his most famous design, Central Park. And then next we'll have Carl Abbott, Emeritus Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University. Carl's research and writing covers incredible breadth, from the roots of Washington, D.C. To cities across the West. And since he arrived here in Portland 40 years ago, yeah, 40 years ago, he has really been our chief chronicler of the region's history. To pick one of his many books on Portland in 3 centuries, which is this amazingly compact documentation of the city from pre-contact to the aughts. And it isn't just like the famous people. It really reaches down to immigrants and artists and dissenters and all kinds of stuff. And Carl's going to share some thinking about Olmsted in Portland, which was mainly John Charles Olmsted, and actually how this kind of park planning has sort of worked out in the history of the city. So with that, I'll turn it over to Catherine. Thank you so much.
So tonight I'm planning to talk about Frederick Law Olmsted, who, as you know, is celebrating his 200th birthday this April. But I think it's important to put Olmsted within the larger context of what was going on in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, and the larger call for parks at that point. And then also how he thought about the best way to manage the park and make it a democratic space, and what that involved in terms of enforcement and honestly policing. So when New York first started to lay out the grid in 1811, they didn't actually set aside very many parks. They didn't think that it was necessary to have parks, mostly because there were rivers on either side, the East River and the Hudson River. And they felt that, unlike in London or Paris, where there was just a tiny little river, the Thames or the Seine, New York had such ample rivers that they didn't actually need parks, because they had all this free, fresh air. They had rivers that could promote trade and also leisure there. So they didn't set aside very much. They set aside one large park called the Grand Parade, which was really for military exercises, but they didn't set aside much else besides that. Could you advance this slide? Thank you. By the 1820s and 1830s, this all started to change. And first it started with Washington Square Park, which had been a potter's field or a cemetery, and was transformed into a leisure park. And suddenly the city politicians saw all the real estate around the sides of the park take off. And that meant that property taxes were rising too. And so suddenly they loved parks. They weren't interested in environmental justice in the way that we would be today. And so they were only really putting parks in the wealthiest neighborhoods at the time, not interested in having access for everybody, but rather to have spaces for promenades, for fresh air in those specific neighborhoods, and to just, again, raise property taxes and keep the wealthy from moving to Brooklyn suburbs, and keep them in Manhattan proper. And they were so interested in these kind of elite leisure spaces that they even helped to subsidize parks like Gramercy Park, which you see here, which is a private park when it was established, and it continues to be. You can only access it with a key if you live on the perimeter of the park. So again, it wasn't about access or democracy in any real way. Can you advance the slide? This all starts to change in the 1840s, though, and the conception of parks. And that's really because of the massive amounts of immigration into New York at that time. There was a lot of Irish immigrants coming in from after the potato famine, a lot of German immigrants coming from the political uprisings there, and also just migrants coming, children of farmers who were coming into New York. This is after a major economic downturn, the Panic of 1837. And so there's a lot of just visible poverty on the streets. In addition to that, there's cholera epidemics, or pandemics really, that swept through the city in 1832 and then again in 1849. And the idea that diseases spread by bad smells, they didn't really understand that it was a bacterial infection. They saw parks as a way to alleviate health issues and to solve the pandemic problems that were affecting the city. Can you advance the slide? So what changes then, and I'll read this, there's a push. There are people who start to before Olmsted, to start to call for a large park. First, the mayor, Mayor Kingsland, calls for a park, but there's also Andrew Jackson Downing, a major landscape architect in his own right, who makes writes an article in the Horticulturist, which is widely distributed, calling for a New York park. And then the New York Times in 1852, this is several years before Central Park, publishes an article that calls for a park. And it's much longer than what you see here, but this is kind of the juiciest quote from it. They're saying, let us infuse a little more country into our city. Let our eyes be rejoiced by resting upon something else than interminable rows of brick and freestone. Let us have a place richly equipped with natural beauty and verdant in the midst of this present aridity, embosomed in foliage and filled with fragrant air to tempt us from our too engrossing pursuits, well kept and guarded, and within its shaded precincts, the loveliest artistic creations where genius may bring its offerings and nature and art blend together and work out images of serene and placid beauty, open equally to rich and poor, contributing alike to the pleasure and improvement of the sick and the well, the man of leisure and the man of work. Again, what's new here is that they're calling for a more democratic space, a space that's not just in a tiny neighborhood that's really only impacting a small community and really geared towards the wealthiest New Yorkers, but a space where rich and poor, the man of leisure and the man of work can come to work together. So in the midst of this, Frederick Law Olmsted and his friend Charles Loring Brace, and you see this is a young picture of them. Charles Loring Brace is looking straight at the camera. Frederick Law Olmsted is looking at Brace, and yeah, they're other friends of theirs from Yale. But they're in the midst of this this kind of calling for a park. They start heading to England to go tour some parks and schools. And Charles Loring Brace and Olmsted, and also their Olmsted's brother John, who's kind of has the come hither look at the top corner. They're looking at the parks there, and they're thinking about how can they apply the lessons in England to the problems, the visible poverty on the streets of New York, the fact that there are children begging on the streets, the fact that there are people, houseless people everywhere. There's just a kind of a constant vision of poverty, an Irish problem is what they say most of all. And so they decided that the country can provide some antidotes to the city's problems. And Charles Loring Brace takes that to create the Children's Aid Society, which is a way they're trying to get the kids off the streets, put them into various schools, also send them off into the country, into the Midwest to live with farmers. It was rather controversial. You may have heard of the orphan trains, but that was one kind of solution for the country and the city. And then Frederick Law Olmsted, as he got involved with Central Park with Calvert Vaux, saw that bringing the country into the city in a very a real way in the park itself was a solution, an antidote to modernity, to the quickness of life, to the capitalism and everything else that was happening around them. So what's interesting about this infusion of country into the city is that there was actually a very rural use happening in the land that became Central Park before it was Central Park. There were a number of Irish and German farmers who were living in the southern part of the park, which is on the left side of this map. This is a topographical map that was laid out by Egbert Veal before the park was created. There's also a brick and mortar African-American community called Seneca Village that was in the center there. Can you advance the slide? And so you can see the footprints of those houses in the park. So this was not an empty space. It wasn't a raw blank slate. There were a lot of people who were expelled from the park who were leasing or owning the land. The African-American community in Seneca Village, it was a bunch of people who came together from downtown in Manhattan to escape racial violence, but also it was in reaction in the 1820s to a new New York State constitution that made it harder for African-American men to vote. They had to own a lot more private property than white men. And so this was a way for them to own that property and to continue to have suffrage despite the change in the constitution. So this is a slide, the picture from the Greensward plan that was presented by Olmsted and Vaux. And it's kind of has the before and after. And if you look at the image in the middle, that's the before, you can see evidence of the rural land use, the farming. There's stone walls throughout and rectilinear farm plots. that are there, and they're replacing it with a new kind of rural space, what you see in kind of a small part of the little at the bottom of the page. Actually went back. So in order to have this transformation, because there are so many people already living in the park, and there were also people who used it informally in a rural way, letting animals, livestock out to forage. Also, children would often break off branches from the trees that existed in the park prior to its design to make into matches that they would sell on street corners. So there's a lot of use of the park. People downtown would let their horses free in the park to let them go to pasture when they got to a certain age too. There was a lot, Frederick Law Olmsted saw that you needed a bigger education for the people to use the park, so that they knew that this was no longer acceptable, that you couldn't break off branches, that you couldn't set your livestock out in the park, that you needed to kind of rein things in. So he set up his own police force that was separate from the New York Police Department. The New York Police Department had professionalized at this time, but he had the Central Park Police Force. They had their own police station within the park. They had also animal pounds in the park to collect the loose livestock and other animals that they found inappropriate. And he had, Calvert Vaux did not appreciate this. He called him Frederick the Great, Prince of the Park Police. So there was a bit of mocking going on there. But the rules that Olmsted, it kept expanding too. This was a long list of rules. The police carried them in their pockets. They posted it in the park and they also put them in the newspapers as well. And it kept expanding year after year. But people could only enter through the gates and official entrances. That seems reasonable enough. No one could deface the plants, trees, or pick flowers. No one could pick fruits or nuts. Again, this is a reaction to the foraging, that it's not allowed, you're not allowed to forage anymore. Nowadays, you can go take a foraging tour of Central Park or Prospect Park, or at many parks, to figure out how to eat the weeds or find mushrooms or whatever. But at that point, you were not allowed to do that. No carrying a gun or using stones as missiles. And again, this is a reference to hunting more than any kind of human on human violence. It was that hunting is no longer allowed. You're not allowed to hunt the birds. You're not allowed to do anything like that. No bathing or fishing in the ponds. No setting your goats, pigs, horses, or cows free in the park, or they'd be taken to the pound. And then there was also a set of rules that were really geared towards the working class and the immigrants, because there was a lot of fear if this was going to be a space, a democratic space open to everyone. There were a lot of editorials and newspapers saying, this is all going to become a beer garden. This is going to become a rowdy space that won't be welcome to everybody. And so they had a lot of rules about making sure that the working class, that the immigrants would behave when they were in the park and make it comfortable for everyone. So there's no walking on the walls, no abusive or insulting language, no fortune telling, no games or gambling, and then many, many more rules. I won't get into them all. But the message was, this park is no longer a commons. It is no longer to be used. It is no longer to be used for gathering your fuel for the winter. It's a park, and there is a specific kind of behavior that belongs in a park. And so like the earlier parks that I was mentioning, the Gramercy parks and the other smaller pocket neighborhood parks, this was ultimately, though open to rich and poor, the working class and the men of leisure, it was also still privileging the wealthy and really geared towards making sure that the wealthy were going to be comfortable there. In fact, Frederick Law Olmsted wrote, the preservation of order in the park and its exemption from the presence of influence that would render it disagreeable or unsafe resort for all classes of society is of the very first importance. It requires constant vigilance, as if not well understood that disorder or obscenity on the park are promptly punished, the virtuous and the orderly will be banished from it. And what you see here in this slide is one of the transverses. So if you've been to Central Park, if you try to get across town, you have to take these roads that go under the park. It's the out of sight, out of mind thing. So now it's mostly cars and buses that will be going on these transverses. But as you can see from this image, that it's the hoi polloi, it's everybody else. It's the sheep, it's the fire engine, it's everything else kind of making its way, the chaos that is not supposed to be in the leisurely park. So, you know, in many ways, Central Park was conceived of as a new democratic space, a space for the meeting of people, but and the rich and the poor again. But it was also the way that Olmsted conceived of it, and others of this cultural moment. They saw that you had to really regulate it, that there was a need to police the boundaries of this in order to make it a true democratic space that didn't devolve. And when we start to think about what we want out of parks today in the 21st century, we have to look back at this 19th century moment, because this is where a lot of our habits and our culture about parks was established. So thinking about what are the rules that we have in our parks now, who feels welcome and who feels excluded. These rules have changed over time and changed city to city. Obviously, we don't talk necessarily about some of the ones that he worried about, but at the same time, we still have these rules. So thinking about that is a way, if we want to dream about what we want from public spaces and the policing of public spaces and how we want to transform that, we have to also look backwards too. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. So one thing is, everybody sort of got figured out how to order with the, okay, good. If you haven't, you just scan the QR code with your phone, and you can order from there, and so take advantage of it. Okay, take it away, Carl, and then we'll do questions and answers after Carl's done.
Okay, so.
Yeah, a little closer.
Okay, so Portland at the turn of the last century was afraid it might be coming late to the party. As they looked over the collective shoulder at upstart Seattle, and they wanted to uphold a reputation as the best place, the very best place on the West Coast. And they looked at the eastern cities and saw, well, they'd had World's Fairs and they'd had parks plans. So why couldn't Portland do exactly the same thing? Now, you know, like in World's Fairs, there'd been one in Philadelphia in 1876, been one in Chicago in 1893. Everybody knew about that one. There was one in Omaha in 1898, when Omaha was bigger than Portland. There was one in Buffalo, 1901, when Buffalo was one of the industrial powerhouses. St. Louis was cranking up for 1903. So Portland was worried about keeping up with those cities. And then parks plans. Chicago had a systematic parks plan that dated back to the 1870s. And Minneapolis had a plan. And Kansas City was up to date and they had a plan. Why couldn't Portland have a plan? So they said, let's kill two birds with one stone, and we'll invite the famous landscape architect, John Charles Olmsted, out to Portland to help us. So they offered him $5,000 for each half of the commission, $10,000 total, which would be about, according to the calculator I found online, would be about $300,000 a day, which looks pretty darn good. But he did have all his travel expenses. He was on the road almost constantly, or on the railroad, actually, almost constantly. When he came to Portland, he stayed in the finest hotel, and he had a big, firm back in Boston that he had to keep, lots of employees he had to keep going. So, he had to make a living. So I want to very briefly summarize the results of this visit in 1903, and then talk a little bit about some of the ways to contextualize that visit, because I'm a historian, that's what we do. We contextualize. So next slide. So a lot of people here know about the World's Fair, the Expo in 1905. Olmsted was actually kind of excited about the possibility. because after all, his father had been the key landscape designer for the World's Fair in Chicago a decade earlier, and he thought it was actually kind of cool if he could do not the word he used, he could do the same kind of thing on a fairly similar landscape in Portland. It's the Giles Lake site was a low bluff and then a bunch of kind of a swampy lake. And he focused on the big issues. He focused on things like the sight lines to the different mountains. And there's a sketch from his papers that shows the exact, he measured, I think it was, to get it right, 74 degrees and 18 minutes for the sight line from Mount St. Helens to Mount Hood. And he talked about the need to turn Giles Lake into something nicer. Next slide. Like that, a picture familiar to many, many people in here. He also said, yeah, you people in Portland love roses, so it'd be okay to plant some in front of some of the exhibition buildings. But clearly he was not quite as enthused about roses as people in Portland might have been. Ultimately, the expo was a success, but he didn't actually see it in action. When he came back a couple of years later, after it was over, he was very disappointed to see it was all, some of the buildings were gone, it was all grown up in weeds. But he did say, the postcards reassured me. Scenes like this reassured me that it was really well done. Next. Well, what about the parks? To scope out the possibilities of the parks, he enjoyed long drives around the city in a carriage, driven by enthusiastic Parks Board member and advocate Lester Hawkins. Southeast on one long afternoon, northeast on another long afternoon. This image shows some of the landscape, the underlying landscape that he would have been thinking about. The volcanic cones, the bluffs along the river, the West Hills, and the various landscape features that he was observing. He only had 2 weeks, actually, much less time than he had in Seattle, which was his next stop. So Portland was actually a little cheap. If they'd paid him more money, he would have stayed longer, but Seattle, attracted him. Privately, he complained. He said that the speculators had ruined the West Hills for parks with unbuildable subdivisions on fearful grades. Those unbuildable subdivisions, many of which went broke, helped to give us Forest Park eventually through a long sequence. But he couldn't quite figure out what to do over there for a big park. He zigzagged around the east side. He did find a lot of sites that he could recommend. But again, over there on the east side, the land speculators have been at work everywhere with rather pitiful results. I'm assuming he's talking about some of those gridiron plans like in Southeast, where the roads don't actually connect with each other. Pretty pitiful results in my opinion. And the report that he delivered several months later began with a long introduction that outlined 18 principles about park design that actually became very popular around the whole country. And if you want to read it, it's online. The City of Portland has put it online. And if you want to learn more about Olmsted, more than I know, read Bill Hawkins' book, which has beautifully produced and lots of information. Those are two really good sources to check up on me. And you can then email me later and say, you didn't get that right. Well, what did he suggest? You can see from this summary, he wanted a park around the reservoirs on Mount Tabor. He suggested parks on low-lying lands that developers weren't interested in, like Ross Island and the fair site at Giles Lake and Swan Island and the Columbia floodplain. And he wanted boulevards or parkways where, along the bluff over, Mock's Bottom, above, Ross Island, and a long parkway that would be where Trafalgar Parkway is now located, but then extending all the way into northeast, or actually northwest. So the parks plan was popular. Voters voted $1 million to put it into effect. City officials adopted it as an official plan. And he tried to develop some details on a later visit. But land prices were going up. You could not get what you could get for $1 million in 1903. You could not get for $1 million in 1907 or 1910 or 1911. This is just some images of the downtown building boom, which is also a neighborhood building boom. East Siders wanted more parks. And West Side business people weren't so excited about high taxes. So Portland got part of what Olmsted, projected, mostly some large East Side parks. So let's put it into perspective. First, the Olmsted brothers were a big business. John Charles Olmsted was a very successful businessman.
Just have to do a test for me. Let's do a test.
Okay, how's this?
Better?
Okay, all right. Lean in the back here. He was constantly juggling, Olmsted was constantly juggling dozens of projects, private, campus plans and park plans and individual commissions. We should note.
Hold on just a sec. Let's see if we can get the sound right.
Yep.
Just do a test. Just say test.
Test. How are
We
we
good in the
doing?
back? Okay.
How's this? Test, untest. Retest.
There we
Bingo.
go. All right.
This was a church after all. So the plan for Portland is obviously tailored to the place, but it was not unique. When J.C. Olmsted departed Portland, it was for a substantially longer stay in Seattle, and the plan he produced there, given the different landscape looks, it's the same kind of vocabulary and rhetoric of space that you had in Portland. So for Olmsted, Portland was another job. For Portland, it was something special, a visit by a really important designer. For Olmsted, it was another job. And historian Matt Klingel has actually said that Olmsted's plans were an industrial product, which he means there was a template that he used for college quadrangles or for city park plans that he then adapted to the circumstances. Not much different from the way that consultants today, business consultants or planning consultants, visit a city, descend on a place, and figure out how to use their message for that place. Private clients were very important. Many of the big names, what I have called Portland street people like Ladd and Corbett and Failing and Ainsworth, hired him to do business. A lot of other Portlanders asked about his, talked to him and then decided that his fees were too high. So he was out to make money, as he should. He advised on Westover Terrace. He thought that cutting deep notches into the hillside was a really foolish idea, but he consulted anyway. I do not like the job, but must earn a living somehow, I suppose. It won't be so bad in the end if they do it with a nice finish. He helped to sketch out the plan for Laurelhurst to help turn Hazeldale Farm into the Laurelhurst neighborhood. This is a USGS map showing the developed parts of Portland at around 1905. And if you study it closely, and if we had a lot of time, we'd point out that basically a lot of the boulevards and parkways that he suggested would have gone through undeveloped or semi-developed land areas, and they would have been the focal point for really big, lucrative real estate speculations. And he had suggested a boulevard along the Alameda Ridge that never got built in the way he presented it. But of course, Alameda didn't really need his help anyway. And one more. This is the famous Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map of Portland, or actually it's the red blotch map of Portland, showing neighborhoods ranked by desirability for issuing mortgage loans. And again, if we were to study it closely, we'd see that the parks that were developed out of the Olmsted plan, Peninsula Park and Mount Tabor, Selwood, Laurelhurst, are in the good colors. The best way to put that. And even today in 2022, there is a difference in the quality of parks in the parts of Portland that Olmsted looked at and the eastern part of the city. Admittedly, that was not his charge, but the area that I call Trans-Taboria out there toward the east is still parks deficient, relative terms, and of course the area with people with lower incomes and more limited resources. So in some ways, Olmsted and Portland reinforced a class structure. That's context number one. Context number two, parks or playgrounds. Refreshment for the soul or stuff for kids to do. Olmsted delivered his report as the field of parks development and management was beginning to emphasize active recreation and focus on children, part of the new progressive era values and the rise of the social work profession. There was less interest in large parks with a big rural feel and much more interest in playgrounds and neighborhood parks. There's a trend that actually bedeviled John Charles Olmsted. The last year of his life, he designed a beautiful park and have a city plot playground equipment down in the wrong spot. Seattle was particularly vexatious on this point. So Portland's sort of off the hook on that one, but Seattle. And what more? This comes from this is a map from the City Parks Plan of 1936. That doesn't look like a parks plan. That looks like social geography. It's, by 1936, the City Parks Plan was embedded in an analysis of population patterns and social dimensions rather than in landscape per se. This is not a map that would have appeared in a John Charles Olmsted report. Third point, automobiles. When Lester Hawkins toured Olmsted around the city in an open carriage, there are only 11,000 automobiles registered in the entire United States. By 1911, his last visit to Portland, there were 200,000 in the United States. This is the year when Olmsted had, that last year when Olmsted had a very chilly auto ride from the Waverly Club, where he'd been consulting, to Selwood, and what I assume was an open automobile. I got colder yet in an automobile with the keen wind. He was happy to get on the streetcar where it was warm. And parkways in the Olmstedian tradition were to be leisurely places for carriage drives. Same thing with with the boulevards to be aligned with stately houses. And of course, the automobile isn't very good for that. The speed, the noise, the fumes, that upsets the equation. So what the one parkway that was built out of the Olmsted plan is Terwilliger, here where you could get nice views before all those darn trees grew up. And this was the one that built in the 1910s, one element that really implemented his kind of parkway vision. It was built just as automobiles were really taking control. By the 1920s, drivers were demanding that it be paid so they could really zip into town. And Terwilliger was the main auto artery into the city until, Barber Boulevard was built in the 1930s to take some of the pressure off of Terwilliger. And by the 30s and 40s, as transportation folks know, parkway no longer meant something that John C. Olmsted would have envisioned, but it meant, nicely landscaped, moderately limited access roads for cars to zip along. Grand Central Parkway, Merritt Parkway, Washington Baltimore Parkway, Victory Boulevard in Cincinnati, which I've driven on many times. So Olmsted was planning for an era that was passing. And finally, last point, comprehensive planning. Less than a decade after Olmsted's visit, Portland business leaders invited Edward Bennett to do a comprehensive land use plan for the city. Bennett provided breadth where Olmsted had provided depth. Bennett was a partner of Daniel Burnham, had worked on the so-called City Beautiful plans for San Francisco and Chicago, which were really truly comprehensive plans. So the Bennett plan for Portland, in this rather muddy image, you can see that some of the park ideas from Olmsted were picked up, like the Ross Island and some of the West Hills, but a lot of them were rejected. He saw industrial on the lower Willamette and Columbia, just as we have here, the Giles Lake site, Swan Island, not very parky, but quite useful for the city economy. This is an image from the plan of Chicago that Bennett and Burnham worked on. The original parks plan for the 1970s for Chicago park system is inside that inner circle, the inner half circle. You can see it's a regional in focus at this point, much more expansive. This is the original plan that turned into the Cook County Forest Preserves, actually created at the same time as the plan of Chicago, but it took about 20 years of wrangling before it was really implemented. Or something like the Denver Mountain Park system of the same 1920s. Thinking about parks as a regional system for automobile access, a very different era. So let me end with a final slide. I sort of apologize for this image from Metro. It kind of looks like a poppy seed muffin, but all of us have enjoyed at least some of Metro's regional parks. And I'd argue that this kind of Metro vision of regional open space planning is finally giving us maybe the right combination. A regional open space network on the Burnham-Bennett scale with something of Olmsted's regard for accessible natural landscapes. So on that high note, I will end, turn it back to Randy, and of course for the audience to fight back.
Okay, good. All right. Amy, if you can just put up, there's a couple of slides after Carl's presentation that I just kind of wanted to put a pin on a couple of things he said, and then kind of pose a question. Yeah, that's the slide. So, John Charles Olmsted, really in many ways pioneered the business of landscape architecture. He, like his father, he was an organizational genius, but it was really focused on both park design, but building this business. He was, an astute observer of his corporate clients. He, utilized larger, companies' methodologies for record keeping. This is an archive. So Portland somewhere is in those plans, right? So he's this really interesting character. He's almost, kind of a compulsive sort of character. It's really interesting. He wrote 5,000 letters to his wife. And really his career is documented, in these letters, these day-by-day letters. Every day he was in Portland, he would write to his wife. And he would sort of talk about what had happened that day with Nixon. He seemed to have a lot of gastric trouble that he was, talking about a lot. He was, but there are also these amazing observations, and many of which, as Carl pointed out, were jobs that didn't really go anywhere. What was interesting too was he also hated writing parks plans. He really didn't like it. It was kind of he, worked hard on them. There was a lot of boilerplate in them. The stuff that he did originate, he would use a stenographer. And one of his problems in Portland was he couldn't find a good stenographer. So it was really interesting just to pick up on these details. But he also layered his parks plans. So there was the part that was public, and then there was the part that wasn't public, which only would go to the parks boards because he didn't want to cut loose land speculation. In Portland's case, the Parks Board was entirely made up of developers. And so, so this sort of mix of commerce at the time, and after the great extravaganza, as Carl's wonderful book on the 1905 fair, unleashed this land speculation. And so it's quite interesting to look at Portland in this kind of context of somebody creating a business. But I have a couple of questions for you guys, and then I want to turn it to the audience and see if there's anything that's going to come up on Zoom. So please, if you're on Zoom, give us some questions. First off, Catherine, when you walk around in a park today, what do you see of Olmsted's, the sort of residue of his thinking about how a rules-based parks system works? Like when we ran into each other in Laurelhurst Park, when you walk around that park, what do you think of as Olmsted in that park?
Well, yeah, sorry. I think there are a lot of influences, even just in the bare bones design of it, with a kind of curvilinear pathways in Laurelhurst Park. But there are rules. There's rules that are posted at the entrances, a list of when the park is open, when it's not. And I'm not saying I'm anti-rule. I just think we have to maybe look at them and think about the access. You're not allowed to feed the ducks. You're not allowed to do this. You're not. I've seen people harvesting flowers, and my instinct is to like snarl at them, but and be like, keep the flowers there. But that is still it's a lingering. You wouldn't. It's not an approved use to go set up a flower stand to sell the flowers that are growing in the park. I think that might be right, but still there are other other rules that you might want to think about in terms of just who's using the park. Is it everybody in the city? Is it a pure demographic spread? Does everybody feel comfortable in Laurelhurst or some other park? It's a question mark. It's as we continue to think through these, especially in post 2020 with our own racial reckoning in the city. I think it continues to be something we have to look at.
So so much of the idea that you talked about was what was called at the time Rus in Urb. So country into the city. This kind of almost civilizing component of country in the city. when you look at Portland, I mean, it's interesting, because there was a whole lot of country and landscape all around us, big landscape, very different than the East Coast. Both of you, actually, I'm curious, do you think that that was an inhibitor to thinking about parks at that time, because there was so much landscape and because there's these volcanoes everywhere?
Well, just to put it in the context of New York, there was still a lot of country within the city, even in the 1850s and 1860s, just as there were farmers and market farmers, but even just a little bit further north, there were still people keeping livestock. There were kind of what they called then shanty towns. It's kind of a derogatory word, but kind of more places where people had chickens and geese and goats and other livestock right and close to Central Park. So even in that situation, the rural was close. Even if there was a lot of built up area, it was much more built up in the 1850s than certainly Portland was, but in 1903. But even with that, in that context, there was still a lot of rural there. Even they were just changing. It was a new
wilderness. In the same sense of like.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. But,
I mean, if you think about like Multnomah Falls being a city park,
right.
Connected by a highway, the sort of access to nature, and that sort of influence is just so different.
It is different. That's true. Probably.
Okay, got it. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so thinking about Portland, I mean, the parks that Olmsted, that Portland built were basically the East Side parks, the moderately, Peninsula Park, Mount Tabor, that were kind of neighborhood development anchors. And, we really did not get, I think, truly nature in this. I consider Forest Park nature on the edge of the city. But Oaks Bottom is, I think, nature in the city, which is a very recent phenomenon for Portland. I think it is partly because there was so much landscape around. And also when Mount Tabor was, at the turn of the century, there were Japanese, farmers on the backside of Mount Tabor. So again, rural, Portland is not a terribly big place. Rural was relatively close. So parks, I think, were very much seen by the city leaders, developers as, development anchors. And whether they be parkways or whether they be like the community scale parks.
Sabrina, I think you can take down the slide now. Yeah, thanks. So questions from the audience. John, Russell, so you're gonna have to speak really loud, and I'm gonna repeat it. So yeah, so keep that in mind. Yeah, but they were also developing stuff. I mean, all of them were had investment interests, and so that sort of separation of commerce and state. I don't mean it disparagingly. It's more of an observation that that boundary that Olmsted saw and constantly complained about actually was in full force here. That was my point. So anyway, the question was, sorry, I forgot to repeat the question, was that I made a sort of disparaging remark about the Parks Commission being full of developers, and John made the distinction that they were landowners, but in fact, all of them had land that they ultimately developed. So, yep. Yeah, but the commercial interests were very fluid, shall we say. Other questions? Yeah. Can you distill that? I couldn't quite hear him. So
I'll try to distill, but please correct me if I didn't hear you well, because of ambient noise. But
there you go.
all right. So I heard the comment was that that the rules were made to kind of double down on the idea that this mixing of classes in Central Park couldn't happen, that it would become a beer garden. And so they were trying to police this to really prove the naysayers wrong. And that the worst behaviors, the people who behaved worse were the Vanderbilts or the wealthy who were taking their carriages and speeding through the park blocks. And I think it's, you said something about the design of the park and how that helped, I couldn't quite hear, but it helped or hindered the surveillance and things like that. One place that's very interesting is the Ramble in Central Park. Is a very hard place to surveil. It's very difficult to see who's coming or what's happening. And it was through the 19th and into the 20th century, a place for cruising among gay men too, without the ability for police to watch too. So there were some ways that the design countered some of the surveillance and the behavioral monitoring that that Olmsted really wanted in the park at that as he conceived of it in the mid 19th century. So yeah, it's a mixed bag for sure, and the bad behaviors happened all around, no matter the class. It wasn't all just about the poor and how they should be behaved, but it definitely was about. He said outright that he was trying to make the park comfortable for the bourgeois classes to come in and feel that they could be there. Because if it became unwieldy, unruly, then only the poor would come, and then his whole experiment would falter. And so the ruling of and the monitoring and the surveillance and the constant policing was really about that. So very much what you said.
Why don't you come up a little bit close so we can hear you? Thank you. Carl, do you want to take on the sort of more contemporary history part of that question? So the question is let me try to repeat it. So are there protections in place for the existing sort of design of the park system, and what mechanisms are in place to further expand it? Would that be a fair distillation of your question? Given the growing density, yeah. Given the growing density of the city.
Yeah. Okay, number one, there is a crew of Olmstedians in Portland who are very, vigilant about, and park advocates very vigilant about, Portland parks. I don't think there's any, there's in all the discussions of everything from increased housing density to, temporary, locations for unhoused people. Parks are definitely, not on the table. And I don't know, in part, that's the structure of Portland's commission government, in which you have an individual commissioner in charge of parks who is kind of loyal to that strand of the government, that silo, if you will, that in some ways is a protection. And once we change the charter, which looks like it's likely to happen, there'll be some different structure under which, parks are managed and, protected. But I don't see any, any challenges to the basic park structure, park system. They can't have my neighborhood park. That's all I can say.
So there is a planning process. The most recent one that's really been in effect is Parks 2020, which was started in the early aughts, actually 2000, I think is when it began. And it set forth a policy to have a park, within, I believe it's a half a mile of every household. And we're still working on that, especially in East Portland. New parks are largely funded through something called systems development charges, which is a tax on units of housing and on development. That is, about, I don't know, last I checked, when I built a little triplex, I had to pay $5,000 a unit at that time. I think they reduced it a little bit. And that's what fuels new parks and expansions of existing parks. There's a larger parks planning process, going on now to kind of renew Parks 2020, and that's sort of unfolding now under Commissioner Rubio and the current director Adina Long, and we'll see where that goes on the capital side. But I'd say the main threat to parks now is really on the unfulfilled maintenance problem. And, the levy helped. So all those who voted for the levy, yeah, that helped at least for the next 5 years on maintenance of the grounds. But there's about $500 million in infrastructure and buildings and facilities that is an unmet maintenance need, and that's the real threat to the system. That's the existential and physical threat. And over the next 2 to 3 years, as we all think about the future of parks, how we're going to start chipping away at that has got to be a major part of the discussion. So hopefully that gives you some sense of it, and I'm sure that it's going to be revisited at the ballot box in some form or another, and hopefully Portlanders will keep being generous to parks. Other questions? Yeah. Seven-year newcomer is asking a question. Why don't you come up a little closer? It's pretty echoey.
Yeah.
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 I have to say, I don't have any knowledge. So the question was, our seven-year newcomer who lives in outer East Portland is really impressed by the co-location of parks facilities along with school facilities. Did I understand that correctly? And I can't really speak to that. I know that that's been something of a dialogue about that. And there's some, there's, for instance, several schools. David Douglas is one that has, pea patches, we used to call them in Seattle. I'm forgetting the word that they use in Portland for them, where people, community farms, community gardening areas. But that's all I really know about those conversations. Carl, do you have any? No? Okay, okay. Okay, one more question, and I think that we might have to admit technological defeat tonight, and we'll have to kind of rethink our. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Hi. Yeah, please, come on up. Okay. If you promise not to take over the microphone, you can actually say it in the microphone. Come on up, please. Yeah.
So I have a question about public golf courses, and what do you think Olmsted would think about public golf courses being run by the city? And what do you think about public golf courses being run by the city and like class issues or accessibility issues?
Carl, you want to take on that little firecracker?
Good question. Good question. What we professors always say when we don't know the answer. Yep.
So I don't know that golf was big in the 1850s, so I'm not sure that he would, but I think that if he could make an argument that everybody was going to be using the golf course, then I think Olmsted would get behind it. But if it's hard to make that argument, I'm not sure that he would have necessarily. The original Olmsted, I should say.
Any ruminations on golf?
Well, my understanding is that, some of the public golf courses in Portland have had, declining usage and some problems of, the amount of revenue generation, vis-a-vis what they need for maintenance. And at the same time, golfers are well organized and articulate, and there's, people in political positions often do not like to touch hot potatoes like golf courses. So I am dropping that hot potato as fast as I can.
So contrary to popular perception, golf is actually financially healthy in Portland. They had some problems a few years ago, but it's going quite well now. So it's really a question of, I know open space advocates that are very pro golf that don't play golf because of, the lung function, the green space function, the habitat function that they conserve, particularly for birds. They're not pure habitat, but they're not, they're also not, necessarily degrading. There's differing opinions about this, of course. And then there's, people who are really anti-golf because it's, perceived as elitist. But if you go to, for instance, Colwood, you'll see that it's, all kinds of people out there. Rose City, you see all kinds of people. But I will also admit my bias. I grew up playing on municipal golf courses. And so I have personally a great love of them. But there is this mythology that they, or not mythology, there was some problems in the golf program. Those have been fixed. The pandemic has been very good to golf in Portland, because a lot of people have either taken up the game or retaken it up to, be outside with their friends. So that's all I have to say about the hot potato. And sometime when we have a forum with Director Long or Commissioner Rubio, you can tackle that one. There's differing opinions on the city council about it, I'll tell you that. So you had a question and we'll make that the last one. So I think actually that's an interesting thing for both of you to address, because what was there a recreational notion beyond the sort of pleasure grounds and the promenades in Central Park and in Frederick Law Olmsted's work, and then did it play at all into John Charles Olmsted's work in Portland?
So in the mid-19th century, there wasn't as much programming as we have now by far. This is our parks departments serve large. They serve larger roles and as community centers and all the activities. It's multifaceted. And my understanding, and Carl, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that a lot of that comes out of the sort of first the playground movement of at the turn of the 20th century, when you have a big push in a lot of cities across the country for playgrounds, and right at the time that Portland's getting our parks. And then into the New Deal, and you see the expansion of park programming, then where you have just many more ways to keep people busy. I'm teaching a course in the spring about Peninsula Park, and if you start to look at the pictures, the historic pictures from Peninsula Park, that's when around the time of the Great Depression is when you see the community center in huge use for pottery classes and volleyball tournaments and things like that. It really kicks up. So it's more of a 20th century moment, and we just keep seeing it grow through funding now. But Carl, again, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So you can see some of the transition in Portland with, E.T. Misch, who was the handpicked park superintendent, had worked for Olmsted's firm, came to Portland from Madison, Wisconsin, and was parks director, superintendent for like 1908 to 14, I think. And he's probably in the one sentence, you'd know him for having worked on the plantings in the Ladd's Addition circles and Peninsula Park. And he also helped to get Terwilliger Boulevard going, but he also oversaw playgrounds and swimming pools and community centers being constructed. So he kind of represents that transition era of the, what you're looking for in parks. And then by the 1930s, exactly what Catherine is talking about, and the figure, extremely influential, parks, and by the 1930s, Dorothea Lynch is director of Parks and Recreation. So you can see a change of the definition of that role, and the role that the parks are, what they're coupled with.
And then the Moses plan was really about playgrounds, wasn't it? Yeah. So Robert Moses, and I'm going to blank on what year, did a comprehensive plan for Portland. Carl, help me out here on the dates and the specifics.
1943.
1943.
Yeah, and there was money. He proposed money in that plan for kind of park and playground improvements, but not for big new, not big new regional systematic stuff. It was keep what take what you have, add more playgrounds, keep things going.
Yeah. A couple of Zoom questions. To get them closer to my eyes here. So Carol Lee is curious about New Yorkers' response to Central Park rules when they were new in the 19th century, or at any time. Were there significant acts of resistance? And were there any accommodations or compromises made?
So any list of rules or any, it's a great question, Carolee. Any list of rules is always an ideal, right? It's not going to be perfectly enforceable. And so people were constantly breaking the rules, and there was constantly issues, and it would come up in the annual reports of what Olmsted would be reporting to the city about, oh, these are the infractions that would happen. So there was pushback, and you can never perfectly, although he may have tried to be a, Frederick the Great, Prince of the Park Police, he really couldn't exert the kind of control that he wanted. And the park in the years following would take off, as every park does, and people make it their own, and it becomes their living room, and people transform these parks. So no matter what the rules are, no matter what the ideal for policing is, it's not gonna be the reality.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you bearing with our experiment tonight. We learned some stuff. We'll tweak it and make it better for 2 weeks. From now, we'll have Vivek Shandis, who is on the Urban Forestry Commission and is also a PSU professor, and Sienny Corbin, who's a Parks Board member. And they'll be talking about beyond recreation. And they're both really compelling thinkers, and I hope you'll circle back and join us. I mean, we're going to be talking about all kinds of new ways to think about parks in the era of climate change and the racial reckoning. It should be a really, really interesting program, and I hope you can join us, and we'll iron out some technical difficulties, and we'll have a good time then. So thanks again. Thanks to our sponsors, US Bank, and to our venue, Steeplejack. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Okay, thanks.